Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Okay, so today we are going to look at the fourth model of anxiety. And correct me if I'm wrong, David, this is going to be the motivational model, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, great. So how do we use this model in the treatment of anxiety then?
Great. By the way, good morning, Fabrice.
Oh, good morning, yes.
And we have one or two little announcements before we dive into this final edition on the treatment of anxiety. We'll have a lot more in the future on interpersonal exposure techniques and on benzodiazepines, the truth about benzodiazepines, should they be used in the treatment of anxiety, drugs like Xanax and Valium that are so intensely popular, and a lot of really fun additional topics on anxiety, but we'll save them for some future podcasts so we get onto different kinds of topics since we've had several on anxiety. And then the other announcement is that we want to remind people about a couple of things. First, we're giving kind of an overview here of the treatment of anxiety and depression, kind of to whet your appetite. Some of you may want to dig deeper, whether you're coming from the point of view of a therapist wanting training or an individual wanting personal healing for your own depression or anxiety or relationship problems. If you're a therapist wanting more training, you can go to my website, feelinggood.com, and take a look at my workshop page. I'm doing workshops around the country on various themes, 2-day workshops and sometimes 4-day workshops, the intensives. You can also go to www.feelinggoodinstitute, that's one word, feelinggoodinstitute.com. They're in Mountain View, California, and one thing they offer, which I think is just fabulous, I don't have any commercial interest in it whatsoever, but they offer weekly webinars for small groups of therapists who really want to learn how to do team CBT. And they have other treatment and training options on that website as well.
Yes, and I want to emphasize the word treatment as well, because for people who are local to the Bay Area, they do have a clinic, and you can actually go and work with some very experienced therapists there.
Yeah, or if you're from anywhere in the world, some people go there for an intensive for a few days of multiple sessions per day, and for some people that can be an option as well. Let's see, there was one other thing I was going to mention, but now I can't remember what it is. So why don't we just go ahead and dive in?
We'll come back to you. Yes, let's dive in.
Also, those of you who have been emailing comments and stuff to my website, feelinggood.com, I sure appreciate that. I've been answering a lot of them directly, and this is creating a kind of a dialogue between Fabrice and myself on the one hand and you folks on the other. So we can, so I can comment on various questions that you ask right there on my website as well. Now, the motivational model is the fourth model that I use in the treatment of anxiety, and I want to emphasize that if you want to get a complete elimination of symptoms, you need to know how to integrate all four models with every patient, or every client, whatever word you want to use. A young man came to me in Philadelphia for the treatment of severe PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
His story was he'd been working at like a Burger King or something like that, and he was closing up at night, Sam was, and two kind of sadistic armed gunmen came in and robbed the place, and before they left, they threw him into a walk-in freezer and locked him in there and went out laughing, left him there to freeze to death, and went out laughing at what a clever thing that they'd done. The next morning, the manager came in early and noticed the lights on and the doors open, realized something was wrong, and opened up the walk-in freezer, and there was Sam, still alive, but badly traumatized. And
Right.
And then for the next 6 months, he recovered physically. They never found the armed gunman, but he started having panic attacks all day long, rage attacks all day long, totally incapacitating to him. He was not applying for disability or anything like that. There were no financial issues involved, but he came to me saying that his life had been really kind of ruined by this episode, and he was in a constant state of distress and angst and misery and panic and rage and anger. And he said he would wake up. He couldn't even sleep well at night. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming sometimes with horrible dreams, or waking up in a rage or a panic. Sam had been reading about veterans, Vietnam veterans or Iraq War veterans, Afghanistan, and their severe symptoms of PTSD, and how often they received years of different treatments in the VA hospital without good results. And he wanted to know if he was hopeless. Was there any chance for someone as severe as he was? I told Sam that he was in luck, and that we had tremendous new techniques to treat his PTSD. That is PTSD.
And what year was that, approximately?
Well, I don't know. This must have been, it would have been probably around 1990 or something. Okay. It was a good 25 years ago. Yeah. But the techniques were really quite new at that time. By the way, we just had a brief electricity out, and the computer went on the backup battery, but it's off now, so we're in good shape.
Sure.
And I told him that his symptoms of PTSD were actually caused by his negative thoughts, the messages that he was giving himself, and that those thoughts were often distorted, and that when you change the way you think, you can change the way you feel. We couldn't make the trauma itself disappear, but that his feelings were entirely created by his thoughts, and so that the prognosis was good. And I explained that in addition, we had tremendous visual imaging techniques available, that he was having flashbacks, and he would remember the episode and either get very angry and have fantasies of getting revenge on these fellows, or imagine getting mugged on the streets of Philadelphia, or getting murdered or something like that, and that he would picture these things, and that these pictures in his mind were also causing the intense negative feelings he was experiencing, and that we could modify these pictures in his mind using visual imaging techniques, and modify these distorted negative thoughts, and the prognosis was actually excellent. And then he asked me, well, how much improvement could I hope for? Are we talking 25% reduction in symptoms, or 35%, or what? And I said, well, no, Sam. I said I'd be looking for dramatic reductions in your symptoms. In fact, a complete elimination of your symptoms, so you could get back to joy and self-esteem. And he seemed very skeptical at that point, and he said, well, how long would this take? Are we talking about years of treatment or decades of treatment? what could he look forward to? And I said, well, Sam, I can't guarantee any particular outcome. That's, impossible and also unethical. But I can tell you what my hunch is. And my hunch is that it would probably just take a handful of sessions and we could complete the treatment. Might even be, 4 or 5 sessions, something like that would be my hunch. Now, I thought that he would just be thrilled to get this message from me. Here is a young man who's Go ahead.
No. Right. I mean, I agree with you. You propose something that would be like a dramatic improvement for him. You would think that he would jump at the opportunity.
Yeah, you go to a doctor, you have horrible suffering. The doctor says, hey, there's a great prognosis, we got a good treatment, it's likely going to make your problem disappear entirely. I thought he'd be all happy and excited, and instead he turned on me like an angry wounded lion or something like that. And, he's kind of throwing 4 words at me. He seemed to be kind of in a rage, and it's like I was his worst enemy in the world. Now, what I'm going to do is ask you listeners to do a little bit of thought exercise. If you're driving, just think about it. But if you're sitting at a desk, take a piece of paper out and do a little written exercise.
And you may want to pause the podcast if you can right now.
Yeah. Once I give you the instruction, then pause it and do this fun exercise. And then once you've written down what I want you to write down, then you can turn the podcast back on, and I'll give you the tell you what happened. But essentially, he was doing what looks an awful lot like what we call therapeutic resistance, and this is the motivational model of anxiety. And you remember that there's outcome and process resistance for depression, for anxiety, for relationship problems, and for habits and addictions. And one of the unique things of team therapy is new methods for melting away therapeutic resistance. And you're getting into therapeutic resistance when the patient is fighting you, resisting you, yes-butting you, and you're pushing, trying to help, and the patient is pushing back, and you're kind of locking horns. And so this was a beautiful example of resistance. And so what you want to do when a patient is resisting, the outcome resistance for anxiety is magical thinking. You see, the anxious patient believes that the anxiety is going to prevent something bad from happening. And so if you don't address that and you try to cure the anxious patient or help the anxious patient, whatever way you want to look at it, and you haven't addressed the outcome resistance, the patient will fight you. And that's exactly what's happening with Sam. And so one of the 2 things I want you to do when you pause the audio recording is to write down, if you can think of in fact, draw a line down a piece of paper from the top to the bottom, a vertical line splitting the paper into 2 columns, and label the left-hand column ADV for advantages and the right-hand column DIS for disadvantages. And I want you only to work on the left-hand column and see if you can write down several advantages or benefits for Sam to continue to feel panicky, to have panic attacks and to have rage attacks and to continue feeling extremely upset about this event. Reasons why he might very well want to fight against a therapist who offers to make these symptoms improve or disappear. That's your first assignment, and that probably will be easy for you. I've tried to give you an example that will help you understand this rather than be confusing to you. And the second thing is, I want you to think of some errors that Sam's shrink made. You see, and this is perhaps for therapists primarily, but if you're a general public person or client, a patient, it's important for you to understand this too. What errors did I, the therapist, make? Sam described a problem, and I jumped in and tried to help. What were David's therapeutic errors? and see if you can jot down one or two errors, that obvious glaring errors that David made. So what should we just count 1, 2, 3 and then say pause?
Well,
and
yeah, just pause now. Okay, so hopefully now you're back and you've done this exercise. So can't wait to hear the solution, David.
Well, sure. It's a fun thing. Did you do it, Fabrice, or does anything jump to your mind for some benefits to Sam?
Well,
Yeah.
of course, yes. For me, the obvious benefit is that if he is not constantly anxious and vigilant and on guard, this could happen to him again. He needs to protect himself. And
That's beautiful. That's certainly number one. And I asked Sam to do this exercise in the session, and that was the very first thing he put down on the cost benefit analysis sheet that I gave him. Some benefits of his anxiety and his anger, and that's it. It's going to keep him safe, keep him vigilant. If he lets down his guard, he might get mugged again.
Right.
That's a good one. Anything else jump to mind, Fabrice?
Well, I mean, there's a number of things that could be going on. You know, it's personal to each person, but I would say that in this case, this is something really terrible that happened to him, and he just doesn't want to say, okay, well, that was not a problem. I want to let go of it. I just rather be happy right now. It would not be honoring something that was actually objectively traumatic and pretend like it was not a big deal. So
I love what you're saying, and that would be one of David's errors. You see, that's why I developed team therapy, to try to prevent these kinds of errors. First, you do testing. At the beginning of the session, I saw that his anger and depression and anxiety scores were off the charts. He was very severe. And then I should have initially started out with empathy and given him his day in court and tell me how awful it had been for him and what a horrible experience it was. But I skipped that and jumped in to tell him I could make all of this go away in a few sessions, and that would have the impact of kind of trivializing his suffering and saying, oh, well, you know, Vietnam veterans or Afghanistan veterans, they've got real problems. Yours is just a trivial thing and it'll disappear in 3 or 4 or 5 sessions. And so I had a real empathy failure, and that would be another reason and another advantage or another reason for him to fight back against me. So that's a darn good one, Fabrice. Anything else jump to mind? Any other benefits of his anxiety or his anger?
Well, so I don't know the exact details, but I imagine that for Sam, having been the victim of such a harsh attack, there's a certain level of recognition. People see him as having been a victim, and he's seeing himself as having been a victim, and he's getting some attention for this. There's a whole drama and story that forms around that, and curing him would sort of make that story go away.
Well, that's always a certain consideration. Therapists sometimes call that secondary gain, and it's promoted heavily as a source of resistance. I'm really glad you brought that one up. I would say that probably wasn't going on with Sam. He wasn't, trying to get attention or getting a lot of attention. He was just kind of suffering alone. But it's always a consideration. But another thing that came up that Sam wrote down, the second thing he wrote down was I have a right to be angry, because what those men did was sadistic and cruel.
Right.
And then he also wrote down that what he went through was very, very severe. All the things that that you brought up. So he had about 3 or 4 advantages he wrote down of his symptoms. And a cost-benefit analysis is certainly one way of dealing with resistance. But I do it paradoxically. And so the way I did it with Sam is once he wrote down these things, and took him about 5 minutes to come up with several advantages of his anxiety and rage, then instead of trying to talk him out of these things, I tried to talk him into these things. And so I looked at the first thing on his list was the anxiety keeps me safe. And then I said to Sam, well, I'm feeling kind of ridiculous now. Do I have the tools to make your anxiety improve or disappear? Absolutely, I do. Would those tools be effective? I'm pretty confident they would be. But now I'm thinking that it doesn't make sense to use those tools and make your anxiety disappear, because you're living in the most dangerous area of Philadelphia. And there are a lot of murders in that area near, let's say, Drexel University, just to disguise the details a little bit to protect his identity. And now I understand why you were fighting me so heavily a few minutes ago when I said we could work together and make this disappear. So when I made that statement, I was giving up my role as the therapist, and I was instead becoming the voice of Sam's subconscious resistance. And the interesting thing is, if you do that in a sincere and genuine way, and those were genuine, sincere statements, because it is very dangerous where he lives. There is a lot of assault and murders and robberies and that type of thing. And then once I had said that, then he instantly said, yes, but does it really keep me safe? He said, maybe the bad guys can smell it if you're scared and anxious, and they're more likely to attack you. And maybe if you just use common sense and you're kind of relaxed and confident, and don't do something foolish like walk into a dark area at night, he says maybe that's the best way to keep safe. So before I go on here, notice what just happened in that sound again. We had another brief electrical out here, but now it's working again. And so notice what's happening. As I verbalized the reasons not to change, he suddenly took the role of wanting to change, and that's one of the keys to what we call paradoxical agenda setting in team therapy. Now, I didn't want to let up on this, and so I said, well, Sam, you defeated me on that first one. I agree with you. Maybe the anxiety and the panic aren't really keeping you safe. But let's look at this other thing that you wrote down, that you have every right to be angry. And once again, I'm in agreement with you. Do I have the tools to reduce your anger? Absolutely, I do. Could we make it disappear completely? I can't guarantee that, but my prediction is we could do that. But now I'm thinking, I'm embarrassed again to have offered you that, because that would let those guys know that they're getting away with it. It would be like saying, oh, you can rob me, you can sadistically throw me, into a walk-in freezer to freeze to death. Treat me abusively, and I won't be angry. I'll just be happy about it. I'm a doormat. Just use me any way you want. Right. And I said that would be ridiculous, Sam. Your anger shows that you're a man. It shows that you have a value system. It shows that you stand up for a system. And it shows that you're not going to let those guys get away with it. Right. And you've convinced me that we probably don't want to make your anxiety disappear. And so once again, notice what's happening is I'm becoming the voice of his resistance. I'm not trying to persuade him to change. I'm taking the role, and it has to be done in a genuine way, not as a gimmick. You have to really see, yes, he has every right to be angry. He should be angry. We need people to stand up against all the awful things that are going on in the world right now. And then once I did that, again, he then suddenly took the other side of the coin. Because once I'm the voice of the resistance, he becomes the voice of change. And he said, well, yes, Dr. Burns, that all is well and good, and that might be true. But the fact is, the men who mugged me don't even know how angry I am. He said they probably don't even live in Pennsylvania anymore. They're probably down in Florida robbing Burger Kings down there as we speak. And so the only one who's suffering because of my anger is me. I'm making myself miserable. I'm not doing anything that's going to result in them getting arrested or caught. And so
that's
once
very
again,
insightful of him.
Yeah. Well, I find that most patients, can see these things, pretty well. You see, we have this powerful, compassionate, supportive voice in our minds and so when you do paradoxical agenda setting, you're just giving the patient permission, in a sense, to let go of the negativity. But it's very hard for friends, for family members, and for therapists to learn to do this because of codependency and narcissism. We want to be experts and we want to jump in and help exactly, the error that I had made, showing them, oh, I'm so great, I've got these techniques, I'm going to help you. And that actually caused him to fight back against me. And then when you let go of that, you let that codependent, narcissistic, therapeutic helper voice die, and you become the voice of the patient's resistance. It's actually a deep form of empathy because you're suddenly seeing where the patient is really coming from. And once you've honored the resistance has a way of disappearing. Well, the third thing that he wrote down on his list of advantages of his symptoms was that it made sense for him to be upset, because of what had happened to him was very real and really very horrific. And so, again, I wouldn't let him off the hook, and I continued to play the role of his resistance. I said, well, Sam, you beat me on the anxiety thing, you beat me on the anger thing, but tell me, Sam, if you go along with what this new doctor's telling you, and he can work with you in 4 or 5 sessions, and you'll recover, wouldn't that tend to trivialize your suffering? And wouldn't that be kind of an insult to you? These symptoms that you're feeling, the intense anxiety, the panic, the night terrors, the rage attacks, this is really a way of honoring what happened to you because it was real and it was terrible. And so you have every right to have these kinds of symptoms. And if you work with this new doctor using his tools to make the symptoms disappear, wouldn't that kind of mean that what had happened to you was not important, that it wasn't severe? Wouldn't that trivialize it for you? And now notice again, I'm becoming the voice of the resistance. And when I said that, he said to me, yes, but doctor, but isn't 6 months of suffering enough to make my point? And while I have the right to be miserable, don't I have the right to be happy as well? And isn't it time now for me to set these feelings down? And doctor, to tell you the truth, I'm beginning to look at this entirely differently. And so I said, well, Sam, now let's think about the advantages and disadvantages of your suffering, because I do have the tools and I'd love to work with you, but I want to make sure we're on the same page. So I said, let's balance the advantages of your symptoms against the disadvantages. Remember the 3 advantages? It's going to keep you safe. The anxiety is going to keep you safe and vigilant. And if you let down your guard, something awful might happen. The advantages of the anger, you're right to be angry. What they did was cruel. It shows that you're going to be a man, that you're going to stick up for yourself. And in addition, your suffering honors the horror of what you went through. Those are the advantages. And the 3 disadvantages you've now written down is, number 1, maybe the anxiety doesn't actually keep you safe. And number 2, you're only hurting yourself with your anger. The men who mugged you, don't even know you're angry. And then finally, that 6 months of horrific, miserable suffering is enough to make your point that what they did was truly sadistic and awful and wrong. How do you balance them and put two numbers? And I have a cost-benefit form with two kind of bubbles on the bottom. And I said, put two numbers in there that add up to 100. Show what is stronger, those three powerful advantages or the three very real disadvantages. And he put 35, 65 in the circles. The 35 for the advantages of his symptoms and 65 for the disadvantages.
And the two numbers add up to 100, right?
Yeah, two numbers that add up to 100. And then he looked up at me and he says, Dr. Burns, I think I've changed my mind. What are those tools? I'm really ready to pick them up and use them now. And then I just did the very typical things. I pulled out a daily mood log, had him write down his negative thoughts and identify the distortions in them and come up with positive thoughts to challenge them. We used visual imaging techniques, visual exposure techniques to remember the trauma, make himself as anxious as possible until the anxiety disappeared, until the memories and also the rage fantasies, just by intentionally trying to make yourself anxious and angry, they quickly dissipated, and the memories and the fantasies lost their power to upset him, and he was very good at challenging his own negative thoughts. And it really was just 3 or 4 sessions that we worked together, and his symptoms all went to zero. They didn't improve. They were completely annihilated. And he felt joy and self-esteem, and we did a little relapse prevention training, which only takes about 20 minutes in most cases, and I never saw him again after that. But if I hadn't addressed his resistance, his outcome resistance, with a powerful and valid technique, he'd probably still be my patient today, still kind of fighting me and complaining and insisting that the tools weren't any good and that type of thing. And that's the motivational model for anxiety, but we also use that model in the treatment of depression, in the treatment. But it's different. The way you do it for depression would be radically different from this. In relationship problems and anger, and of course, he also had anger, so we were dealing the resistance for an anger problem. But we do it when treating anyone with a conflicted relationship, the outcome resistance, and for habits and addictions as well, the outcome resistance can be intense. And the way these are melted away, it's different for each type of a problem. But I would say in my whole career, I would say maybe 2 or 3 things I've developed or discovered or learned or whatever that have made the hugest impact on me and the outcome, the effects of the therapy that I do. And I would say that learning to deal with outcome resistance and process resistance has been one of the hugest innovations that have just made therapy much faster, much more effective, and in a way, much more compassionate.
I tend to agree with you, David. I mean, of course, I agree with you because I really have espoused this model, and I would say that the addressing of the resistance has really transformed my practice. And you call this agenda setting. I wanted to briefly talk about the term. What I found is that when I've talked about this to different people, they've gotten confused because they think of agenda setting as making a treatment plan, and it's not that. So I just want our listeners to understand that when we use the term agenda setting, it is equivalent to saying we're going to address the resistance before even applying any techniques.
That's a great point, and Yeah, because therapists think they do agenda setting, but it has nothing to do with these methods. I call it paradoxical agenda setting, but maybe we should change the name further and call it resistance busting techniques, or something
Right.
like that.
Yes. Of course, that would kind of mess up the team acronym, but
Well, we can come up with a new acronym, but yeah, team is good because this allows you to do teamwork with the patient. You see, once Sam was on my side, it was, recovery was just a stone's throw away, and I found that with almost every patient I treat. If I can bust or reduce or melt away the resistance using these new techniques, then the patient works with me, and it's just incredible how easy therapy has become.
I know that's the whole point, because it really impressed me the day you asked me, so what's your IQ? And we're not going to go and talk about what it was, but and then you say, and what's my IQ? And when you add them up together, that's a lot of brain power to really attack those problems. And there's no problem that can resist this if we put our heads together. But if we put our heads against each other, then we're not going to go anywhere.
Yeah. I'll tell you something kind of cool, and I love what you're saying. Last night I had my Wednesday training group for the psychiatric residents at Stanford.
Yes.
I have two training groups, and this was something I forgot to mention earlier. For Bay Area mental health professionals, I have a free weekly training group at Stanford Tuesday nights. It's a 2.5 hour, really joyous group, and we practice these techniques, illustrate them. People go into small groups. But I'd also started a Wednesday group for the psychiatric residents at Stanford, and they initially just seemed like they hated me because I was saying we now have really high-speed treatment techniques, and you can often see a complete elimination of symptoms in a severely depressed or anxious patient in a single 2-hour therapy session. Now, I'm not sure everyone can do that. I know a lot of people don't know how to do that, but that's what I've been seeing in my clinical work, and it's fairly predictable. Well, the residents, they just busted me, and they thought I was a fraud and a phony because they're taught that depression and anxiety build up over years like a huge mountain, and you have to scoop the mountain away with a shovel, shovelful by shovelful, and it takes years for people to recover, and so they couldn't comprehend what I was saying, and they kept saying on the feedback forms they didn't trust me and they didn't believe what I was saying, and then finally last night we had 6 psychiatric residents at that group, and they got it, and it was like so exciting and electrifying. And one of them gave the image of recovery. Think about a lightning storm, and when you look up at the lightning, there's this kind of web in the sky, and the lightning is looking for some way to connect with the earth. And then when it finally finds the spot where it's going to come down, there's this intense lightning bolt, and it lights up intensely, and all this energy goes through, and that there's this sudden transformation. And he says that's kind of like the new model of recovery, that when you get rid of the therapeutic resistance and then you come to the right technique, the recovery is sudden. And when people recover in my clinical work, it often happens in about a minute. Now, it isn't a minute within meeting them. It may be 3 or 4 sessions if you're doing hour-long sessions. It may take a number of sessions or even more before you get to the technique that works. But when people recover, in my experience, it's kind of like a sudden thing. But you've got to get rid of the resistance, plus have good treatment techniques in order to experience this fantastic phenomenon.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this vignette. I think it really puts into perspective how motivation is really like the lubricant that makes therapy happen.
Yeah. Therapy without eliminating the resistance is like trying to run an engine without oil. You're just going to burn it out.
Right. Well, lovely, David. I want to, if you don't mind, I'd like to give people a preview of coming attractions. We're planning to do an entire session with a volunteer who's agreed to work with one of our very experienced and skillful therapist, Jill, from the Feeling Good Institute. And we're going to be doing the entire session from zero to cure, hopefully. And we're going to be breaking this down into segments and really talk about how Jill and you, maybe as a co-therapist, will proceed on how to help this volunteer. And I think this will be very interesting to people to kind of have a blow by blow of how to work with a client.
Yes, that's going to be very, very exciting. I'm looking forward to it too. And the individual who has volunteered, I'm not 100% sure who it's going to be, but I think actually we're going to be recording it in 2 days, right,
yes.
Fabrice?
Yes.
He has a common problem that many listeners can identify with, whether you're a general citizen type or a therapist. Often we beat up on ourselves thinking that we failed in some important way in our life, and this gentleman is kind of beating up on himself and saying he's been a failure as a father. I know this individual, and he's a very warm and really, a wonderful guy, and I know that's going to be a very touching and hopefully inspiring session. And you get a chance to see the work of my brilliant co-teacher of my Stanford group, Jill Levitt, a clinical psychologist, and we love to do co-therapy together, and she's just fabulous. So that is a special thing that Fabrice has set up for us.
I really like how you put Jill on the spot when you're doing a training. I've seen this, and you do that a number of times, where you just finish a sentence and then you turn to Jill and you say, now Jill will say something very smart. And she just like, oh, I'm on the spot.
And she
again.
always does.
And she always does, absolutely. It's true.
That's really brilliant and practical.
That's
and
what amazes me.
It's the heart of gold and the brain of Einstein, so she's fabulous to work with.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, David. That was a great session. And so I think after that we may have a few Ask David podcasts. And I want to encourage people to go onto the website feelinggood.com and leave some questions that we can answer.
Yes, and one last upcoming thing is that one of my new students in the Stanford training group has had a personal background of very horrific political trauma of the worst kind in her country of origin. And she recently asked me the question, can the 5 secrets of effective communication be effective with someone who is violent and hostile and abusive? And so I promised to do a podcast to give 4 examples of people who have interacted with genuinely hostile, abusive individuals, including one who was kidnapped by a serial killer who intended to rape and murder her. Yeah. And so that might be of interest to people too, who want to look a bit more deeply into the 5 secrets of effective communication.
Yeah, that sounds good. Oh, and one more thing comes to mind is for people who are local to Stanford and the Bay Area, how can they contact you, or if they want to join your Tuesday group as clinicians?
There's a contact person. It changes from time to time who our contact person is for the group. Right now it's Chris Stack up in Oakland. But the way to get the contact hers or whoever the contact person is go to my website, feelinggood.com. Feeling Good is one word with 2 G's in the middle. And there, under the resources, it talks about unlimited free training for Bay Area mental health professionals at Stanford. You don't have to be associated with Stanford to come. You just be some kind of therapist. Yeah. And you can get her email I think it's email, maybe phone number there, and then there's a consent form to come to the group and talk about the requirements of the group. Consistent attendance and things like that are required, but it's totally free of charge, and we have a great time.
All right. Well, thank you, David. I think that's enough for the announcements. And so join us again for our next episode. This was episode 28, I think.
Wow, 28. Okay, goodbye, Fabrice. Okay. Have a great day. It's always a joy to work with you. It's one of the highlights of my week.
All right. Thank you, David. Bye-bye. This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.